If it's Friday, President Trump answers reporters' questions during a freewheeling meeting with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy at the White House as Kyiv pushes for more lethal military aid, including U.S.-made long-range missiles, ahead of President Trump's next face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin. Plus, President Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, pleads not guilty to federal charges he illegally retained and transmitted classified information, as Bolton fires back, calling himself the latest victim of the president's political retribution campaign. And New York City mayoral candidates square off in a fiery debate about the future of America's largest city, clashing on housing, affordability, crime, and how they would handle the Trump administration. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy just wrapped up a meeting at the White House with President Trump as Ukraine pushes the U.S. to give it more firepower in its war against Russia. And President Trump looks to secure another ceasefire deal. This was the Ukrainian leader's third visit to the White House just this year in what has been a somewhat tumultuous relationship with the Trump administration. Today, President Zelenskyy came to Washington with a very specific offer: Ukrainian drones in exchange for U.S.-made long-range Tomahawk missiles that have the ability to strike deep inside Russia. While President Trump signaled some level of willingness to negotiate a deal, he repeated his concerns, which he first raised yesterday after a phone call with Vladimir Putin about providing those Tomahawks to Ukraine.
You know, we need Tomahawks, and we need a lot of other weapons that we're sending to Ukraine. One of the reasons we want to get this war over is exactly that. It's not easy for us to give. You're talking about massive numbers of very powerful weapons. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about. Hopefully they won't need it. Hopefully we'll be able to get the war over with without thinking about Tomahawks.
At the same time, President Trump also making it clear he's looking to end the war. Both leaders today touted President Trump's ceasefire deal in the Middle East and expressed hope that another deal could be on the horizon.
And my congratulations with your successful ceasefire in the Middle East.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you did it. And I think this is a momentum to finish Russia's war against Ukraine. I think that, yes, we understand that Putin is not ready. I think not ready, but I think that I'm confident that with your help, we can stop this war.
The war in the Middle East was far more complicated. We got that one done. And I think we have a good chance. I think President Zelenskyy wants it done, and I think President Putin wants it done.
Aren't you concerned that the Russian president is trying to buy himself more time?
Yeah, I am. But, you know, I've been played all my life by the best of them. And I came out really well. So it's possible. Yeah, a little time.
Is your gut
it's all right. But I think that I'm pretty good at this stuff. I think that he wants to make a deal.
President Trump says he plans to meet with President Putin in Budapest in about 2 weeks to continue the discussions. It will be their second face-to-face meeting this year. Remember, the two leaders met just 2 months ago in Alaska, where President Trump rolled out the red carpet for Mr. Putin, but ultimately was not able to secure any concessions from the Russian leader or deliver an in-person meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelenskyy. On Sunday on Meet the Press, I will have an exclusive one-on-one interview with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, where we will be discussing all of this and more and get the very latest of what came from his meeting with President Trump. Joining me now is our team of reporters, NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, and with me on set is Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thanks to all of you for starting us off. Gabe, let me start with you at the White House. What are your biggest takeaways from what you witnessed at that meeting today?
Hi there, Kristen. Good afternoon. Well, there were several takeaways, even if we did not get any closer to figuring out details of any potential ceasefire. The president did say several interesting things, including the idea that he is considering providing those Tomahawk missiles in exchange for Ukrainian-made drones. That was really the first time the president has come come out and said that he's considering getting some of those Ukrainian-made drones because he thinks that they are a good weapon, that while the U.S. does make drones, that they could use some of those. Now, the president repeatedly making the case that he doesn't want the U.S.'s supply of Tomahawks depleted, but he did leave open the possibility that he might agree to providing some of those weapons, given his conversations with President Zelenskyy. Something else that stuck out at me, Kristen, was this idea of the meeting between President Putin and President Trump that could potentially happen in the next couple of weeks. The president was asked whether this would be a trilateral meeting, and he came back and said no. If anything, it would be a double meeting, perhaps leaving the opportunity that there could be a meeting between President Putin and Trump, and then between President Zelenskyy and President Trump separately in Hungary. But again, those details are still fluid. No confirmation whether that will happen, Kristen.
And let's follow up with that meeting between President Trump and President Putin, which the White House says is likely to take place. In talking to my Ukrainian sources, Western sources, they are very skeptical that President Putin is ever going to be very serious about a peace agreement until there is blunt force applied. What are your White House sources telling you? What's the expectation of any real takeaways from this meeting with Putin?
Oh, well, look, Kristen, you know that over the past several weeks, President Trump has become increasingly frustrated with Vladimir Putin. And we're also learning a little bit more about that summit in Alaska in August, that according to a source familiar with the meeting, despite the White House saying that it was productive, that what really happened behind the scenes, according to the source familiar with the meeting, is that President Trump raised his voice several times at Vladimir Putin and threatened to walk out of the summit once Putin had rejected the ceasefire offer, and then launched into a historical lecture that did not sit well with President Trump. And if you'll remember, Kristen, at the time, they had this what was billed initially as a press conference, but it ended up being a very short remarks, taking no questions from reporters. Again, behind the scenes, President Trump even more frustrated than we initially knew.
And Gabe, you have an update on the situation in Venezuela, with President Trump acknowledging publicly this week that he has authorized a CIA initiative inside Venezuela, the administration escalating its pressure on the Maduro regime. What did you learn today? Yeah, certainly. The administration is really ramping up its pressure on Nicolas Maduro, trying to oust him from power potentially. That's what Maduro has said has been in the works for quite some time now. Two U.S. officials tell NBC News that the latest strike that the U.S. conducted on a boat near Venezuela actually resulted in 2 survivors. And the president today was asked about that. He actually gave a few details that apparently the boat that was targeted was a submarine or a submersible, perhaps. But then he was asked specifically about potential concessions that Nicolas Maduro had presented to the United States. Let's listen to his reaction.
It has been reported that Maduro offered everything in his country, all the natural resources. He even recorded a message to you in English recently, offering mediation. What should we do in order to stop that?
He has offered everything. He's offered everything. You're right. You know why? Because he doesn't want to around with the United States.
While Secretary of State Marco Rubio was sitting next to the president and didn't want to go into detail, just heard his response. He can't get much more blunt than that, Kristen.
That's about as blunt as it gets. Gabe Gutierrez reporting for us from the White House on another historic day there. Gabe, thank you so much. Courtney, let me turn to you. Let's talk about these Tomahawk missiles. For folks who are watching, why are they so significant? Why does President Zelenskyy want them? And could these Tomahawk missiles, in fact, be a game changer in the war in Ukraine?
So there's 2 real reasons why these could make a big difference in the war. Number one, they just provide the Ukrainians the ability to strike deeper inside of Russia. Now, we should say Ukraine has made amazing advances on their own on the battlefield. I would make an argument that one of the takeaways out of the meeting today was an acknowledgement by President Trump and senior people in the Trump administration that the very nature of warfare has changed by the war between Russia and Ukraine. And that is because they were talking about the U.S. providing advanced Tomahawk missiles, some of the most advanced weapons in the U.S. arsenal, for drones that Ukraine is making, many cases 3D printing, making on their own, that are really changing the nature of warfare. So the Tomahawks would provide them the ability to strike deeper, but it also, like many of these weapons, would be symbolic. It's the United States acknowledging, again, support for Ukraine against President Putin. We've been watching video of him meeting with President Trump about 2 months ago. That is a very symbolic gesture. It would clearly, we've already heard from the Russians, it would make them very angry, especially President Putin. So that would also, be significant. As far as being a game changer, I rarely see any one weapon as making a significant difference, especially when you look at what's happening on the ground there. It has really been a war of inches. So this probably wouldn't either. But again, it would help Ukraine.
Give a little bit of context to what we heard from President Trump, who said the U.S. also needs its stockpile of Tomahawks. How robust is the United States stockpile of Tomahawks? Is there a concern about depleting it?
There has been a concern about munitions basically across the board in the United States, because the U.S. has been providing a lot to Ukraine for several years now. The U.S. has used a lot in the Middle East, both in defense of Israel, against the Houthis. I mean, since February of 2022 and October of 2023, the U.S. has expended a tremendous amount of munitions at a time when they weren't producing as many. So there has been this effort to ramp up the production line to try to get some things like Tomahawks and others, 155 rounds. We hear a lot about that with respect to Ukraine. So the U.S. has them, but many of them are already essentially allocated for other reasons. So giving some of the U.S. stockpile could potentially have make a dent in that, right? That being said, if in fact the president makes the decision to go forward with this, I don't think you'll have military leaders who would say, oh, this is going to put us in serious danger.
We'll have to see what his final decision is. We know some of his allies are pressuring him to give those Tomahawk missiles. Richard Engel, let me go to you now and get your reporting. What are you hearing from your sources in Moscow and Ukraine about both this meeting with President Zelenskyy and this likely upcoming meeting with President Putin?
Well, as you were both discussing, what a difference in tone. When President Zelenskyy first met President Trump in the Oval Office, he wasn't taken seriously. He was talked down to. He was insulted. Now he was treated with a lot more respect. It seems that their personal relationship is much better. And just to stress what you and Courtney were just discussing, so much of this talk was about weapons. So much was about the kinds of weapon systems that could be available, that the United States might provide Tomahawks, which Russia has already said that would be unhelpful for U.S.-Russia relations, would be unhelpful for the war. Russia deeply opposes this coming directly from the Kremlin. U.S. has this weapon. It would allow Ukraine to strike far inside Russia. But it's not that just Ukraine could provide Ukrainian-made drones. Ukraine has enormous experience using them. The war in Ukraine has developed so much since it began. And we were in Ukraine. Our team was in Ukraine when the war began. And it started out almost like World War I, with trenches and artillery and landmines, and there was tanks rolling across the border. But it has changed significantly. Now it is a drone war. And the Ukrainians have learned a tremendous amount on how to use drones in active combat, how they work, how soldiers can deploy them, how they can protect their vehicles against them. Real-time experience. It's not just that they make them. China makes lots of drones. The U.S. makes drones. But having used them in combat, both in an offensive and a defensive capability, is something that at this stage no other country can replicate.
Richard, bring us up to speed, because President Trump now for 2 days has said that India has agreed not to purchase Russian oil. We're not really getting much of a sense of India's perspective on this. What is your take here? What's the significance if they have in fact agreed to that?
Well, he's been trying to pressure India. India is setting itself up as almost a new non-aligned movement. You know, there's a different sort of a different dynamic where there is what's sometimes called the global South. India clearly wants to put itself in that camp, doesn't want to be pushed around, doesn't want to be pressured. At the same time that the U.S. and China are trying to I don't know if they're trying to escalate things or de-escalate things. Today, President Trump seemed like he was trying to de-escalate the situation. So it's almost like we're back in a new Cold War dynamic. In the Cold War, there were three major powers. There was the United States, the Soviet Union, and the non-aligned movement, with India at the center of the non-aligned movement. And I think once again, we're seeing the world breaking down in those along similar lines.
Richard Engel with that stark assessment and tremendous reporting as always. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today and throughout the week. We really appreciate it. Ambassador Taylor, let me turn to you now. And a third meeting at the White House for President Zelenskyy, obviously a very different tone than the one that we saw during that Oval Office blow-up between President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and President Zelenskyy. What was your key takeaway about what we witnessed today?
Krista, I think that the conversation that we've all had about these Tomahawks is very interesting. It does sound like there is it's less imminent that they will be flowing, they'll be moving into Ukraine. But the threat of those Tomahawks has clearly gotten Putin's attention. Putin, when he heard this, asked for this phone call yesterday. It was Putin's request that they do, because he's worried about. Same thing happened in Alaska. I mean, Putin was worried about sanctions, and he wanted a meeting, and he got a meeting, and he got the sanctions postponed. So the question is, can President Trump use the threat, at least the threat, if not the actual delivery of these Tomahawks, to put the pressure on Putin to stop this war?
And did you get the sense, and based on your conversations with people, that there is deep skepticism about this potential meeting between President Trump, between President Putin? President Trump seems to think that he can negotiate this war to an end. Based on my conversations, there is real concern that the only thing that Putin's going to listen to is blunt force, possibly more sanctions to move the needle forward.
There is great skepticism about Putin's desire to end this war. He thinks he can win it. He thinks he can keep pushing on it, even though he's not making any progress on the ground. He's not winning, and Ukraine is not losing. But he hasn't gotten that. But you're right. The only way to convince him is going to be some combination of those weapons, or the threat of those weapons, the Tomahawks and others, the sanctions that we talked about, that Richard's talking about, in terms of cutting off the revenues going into the Russian economy, and then taking those $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank reserves, taking those and providing at least the loan of those to the Ukrainians. That means that the Ukrainians can last 3 years. And that will convince Putin he cannot win. He can't outlast us.
So that's the type of pressure it could potentially take. And what we have seen, it seems, since that summit in Alaska, is an increase in Russian attacks against Ukraine, including against its energy infrastructure. I spoke with the head of Ukraine's oil and gas company, Naftogaz, about Russia's strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. I want to play a little bit of what he said and get your reaction on the other side.
The Russians continue to put us in the darkness, and this winter will be not different from the previous, and we should be ready for any type of solution, any type of situation, and I'm sure we will do our best have to ensure our people with the gas, with the heat, with electricity, with the light as well.
What do you hope comes out of this meeting?
This year, the peacemaking efforts of the U.S. President Trump in achieving a just and lasting peace in the Middle East are historic. All Ukrainians, we are waiting for the moment when President Trump brings a just and lasting peace to Ukraine. However, Russia continues to attack Ukrainian cities, launching dozens and dozens missiles and drones almost every day. This action speak for themselves.
What do you make of what he says, and do you hear that echoed by a number of Ukrainians.
Absolutely, Kristen. So I was there 2 weeks in September and heard that concern about this winter because of these attacks, not just on the electricity grid, but as he mentioned, on the gas distribution. There are ways that they can deal with that, and the Ukrainians have been amazing in dealing with that over the past 3 winters. The last 3 winters actually haven't been very bad. The worry is always it's going to be a brutal winter. They're preparing. They've got ways to deal with this, but that just emphasizes the importance of putting pressure on Putin to end this war.
Well, and you heard him there reference, and quite frankly, President Zelenskyy and President Trump today referenced the ceasefire agreement that President Trump helped to broker in the Middle East. What, if any, pressure does that bring to bear on these talks?
I think President Trump can use that momentum. I mean, kind of on a roll in terms of putting pressure on people. He put pressure on Netanyahu, which was unexpected, and he did it, and he got some results. He can put pressure on Putin the same way. There's the military, there's economic, there's the sanctions, there's the reserves, the Russian Central Bank reserves. That combination, plus the drive that Trump can do, it can push Putin into that direction.
All right, Ambassador Bill Taylor, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your perspective. We really appreciate it. And coming up, the case against President Trump's former national security advisor as John Bolton appears in court for the first time on federal charges that he mishandled classified information. Plus, it's day 17 and lawmakers are still no closer to a plan to end the government shutdown. I'll talk to a top House Republican about how long this could go on and a whole lot more. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton appeared in court today, pleading not guilty to charges he mishandled classified information. Bolton surrendered to authorities this morning at the federal courthouse in Greenbelt, Maryland, after a grand jury indicted him yesterday on 18 counts tied to the retention and dissemination of classified information. Now, each is a sentence of up to 10 years in prison. Bolton did not answer reporters' questions as he left the courthouse. Charges motivated, saying in part, quote, "I've become the latest target in weaponizing the Justice Department to charge those Trump deems to be his enemies with charges that were declined before or distort on federal charges." Former FBI Director James Comey was indicted last month for allegedly lying to Congress during testimony in 2020. And New York Attorney General Letitia James was indicted last week on bank fraud charges. Both Comey and James have also denied. An attorney who's been representing security clearance clients for more than 25 years. Thank you both for being here. We really appreciate this. This is complicated stuff. Ryan, let me start with you. What's next in the case and what happened today?
Yeah, so he pleaded not guilty. This was the initial hearing, and there will be a series of hearings to come down the line. But because this involves, classified information, this is going to be a little bit more of a complicated one. I do think, viewers should understand that those other two cases against Letitia James and James Comey are a little bit distinct from this one because, as he well knows, there's a long history of bringing charges against people who mishandle classified documents and involved in national security cases. These are cases that the Justice Department has traditionally done, whereas you look at the Letitia James case involving this low-level mortgage allegations, that's not something traditionally pursued by DOJ. The James Comey case, they're using his testimony to refer to previous testimony. It's a very complicated case also involving someone Donald Trump appointed directly. So the unusualness of those cases, I think, definitely stick out from that pack of three.
And Ryan, just help us understand, because part of what he's accused of is actually sharing and disseminating this classified information over email to family members, almost in diary-like form. Do you want to pick up on this? Talk a little bit about the implications of that.
I mean, originally, Kristen, I was thinking to myself, well, is this part of the retaliation issue? And then I read through the indictment and I said to myself, oh, no, it's not. I mean, I looked through it and, with my experience with security clearance clients, most folks that talk to relatives about security, protected information, get into trouble. And I was shocked I mean, literally shocked at seeing the level of like, okay, we're going to do a book from day one. And, you know, here's my diary for the day, here's my diary for the day. And I just couldn't understand it.
And part of the problem also is that this email was reportedly hacked. And that's where the exposure comes in and the concern about how this classified information was viewed.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and as I understand it, the Biden administration didn't really want to take it very far because it would have revealed sources and methods, you know, about how we obtained the information that his accounts were hacked. But now that's not so much an issue.
Ryan, pick up on that point, because prosecutors under the Biden administration did decline to indict former UN Ambassador John Bolton. And the other big difference with this indictment is that it's signed by several career prosecutors. That's a big difference from the Comey and Letitia James indictments, which were basically signed off on by a political appointee, to boil it down.
Indeed. You know, the prosecutors in this case actually have prosecuted cases before, which makes it distinct from those other cases with Lindsay Halligan. She's never been a prosecutor before. That was the first time that she walked into a courtroom there. And we, you know, our producer in the room actually observed her go to the wrong courtroom first, then go to the wrong table in the courtroom. There's numerous things that raise serious concerns, I think, about the validity of those cases and the optics of those cases. But this case was handled by career prosecutors.
John, I want to read a little bit of the indictment, toss to a little bit of sound, and get your reaction on the other side. It actually cites Signalgate, that group text chain on Signal by top Trump officials. Quote, according to the indictment, on or about March 31st, 2025, in a media interview, Bolton stated in response to questions about allegations that a senior government official had communicated sensitive government information using a non-governmental messaging application. Here is that media interview with the Dispatch podcast. Take a listen.
What's troubling about the Signal chat group is that it doesn't look to me like it was the first time this group had engaged in it. And this one was bad because they were talking about a U.S. military operation before it was launched. So in real time, if anybody had broken into that and conveyed that information to the Houthis, it could have jeopardized American pilots. It could have diminished our success in the attack. And it's not an answer to say, well, the attack went off okay, no casualties. The damage that's done is that we've shown weakness in our operational security that our adversaries will try and exploit.
So it's extraordinary. Discussing his concerns about the misuse of this Signal group chat and classified information there.
I don't know if I would have gone on TV to discuss these issues or to be so critical, because what's behind door number 2 with himself seems pretty, if the allegations are correct, seems pretty difficult to believe.
And talk about the fact, Ryan, his home and office were actually searched. The significance of the fact that a judge signed off on these search warrants.
Yeah, that's another thing I think which distinguishes this from those other 2 cases, because you had that judicial review of that search, and you needed to, you know, have that before a judge to prove there's probable cause, at least that he could have information in those locations, and those were searched by the FBI. That is not an element that we see in those other 2 cases, which definitely makes it a distinction.
John, final point to you. What are you going to be watching for with this case?
What happens? I mean, we remember a few years ago with General Petraeus. I mean, he ended up getting 2 months of, I believe, probation. I honestly don't know how this one ends, because these are solid prosecutors. This is a solid case. And, you know, I mean, I'm wondering if there's going to be a plea bargain down the line, if that's true, if the allegations are true, because the counts are solid, if accurate.
All right. Thanks so much to you both, John Barry and Ryan Riley. Really appreciate the information. Coming up next, we'll dive deeper into the president's meeting with President Zelenskyy today and the administration's dramatic escalation against Venezuela politically and militarily. Republican Congressman Don Bacon from the House Armed Services Committee is standing by. Keep it right here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back to discuss a very busy day of news. I'm joined now by Nebraska Republican Congressman Don Bacon. Congressman Bacon, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's always great to talk to you, Congressman. Let's talk about yet another historic meeting at the White House between President Trump and President Zelenskyy. President Zelenskyy saying that he was there to push President Trump to give Ukraine those long-range Tomahawk missiles. President Trump seemed hesitant. We don't know exactly what came from that meeting or where things ended, but what were your takeaways based on what you saw, and how critical do you think the Tomahawk missiles are to Ukraine?
We'll hear more details soon, but that's my main takeaway. The president had been signaling that he wanted to send Tomahawks to Ukraine. I think they're needed. And then after yesterday's phone call with Putin and the meeting today, it sounds like he's waffling on that potential delivery of these weapons. These weapons are needed because they're long range, they're very precise, allow the Ukrainians to hit the energy, the oil production and the power generation that Ukraine's been hitting in recent weeks, and they've been very effective at it. But these cruise missiles will give them longer range. And what we got to do is we got to convince Putin he cannot win. And delivering these weapons and doing secondary sanctions on countries that are propping up the war economy of Putin, these things are needed to end the war. And it really baffles me. I see the president doing so well with Israel, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah. I give him A marks on that whole area. I mean, it's been very impressive. But then when you look at what he's doing with Ukraine and Russia, it's very weak. And he doesn't seem to be able to see with moral clarity who's at fault in this war, and that Putin's the invader, Putin's a bad man, and he keeps giving another lifeline at every junction to Putin. And I really don't understand it. How he can be so good at one area and then so, I would just say, weak when it comes to Russia and Ukraine.
And do you see this meeting in Budapest as another lifeline? Do you think it's possible to get a deliverable from that meeting, Congressman?
Well, I'm pessimistic. I mean, something good could happen, but Putin is not interested in peace. He's interested in stretching or tapping along President Trump, trying to delay decisions while he bombs Ukrainian cities every night and goes after he's bombed over 900 hospitals and medical facilities, since he started this war. He's going after civilians. He's trying to terrorize civilians. He's trying to wear Ukraine down. And meanwhile, he keeps dragging President Trump along. President Trump should come in with the iron fist. And so we're going to deliver these cruise missiles. We're going to deliver ATACMS. We're going to give later version of the F-16s. We're going to help train their F-16 pilots. And we're going to do secondary sanctions against Russia. And we got to convince Putin he can't win. But he's vacillating and just has this ambiguity. And all it does is, I think, strengthen Putin's hand. I feel for President Zelenskyy and our NATO allies who have total moral clarity with what's going on here. I just wish our president had that same clarity.
All right, well, I want to shift gears a little bit, talk about another conflict, your reaction to the U.S. strikes on alleged drug cartel boats in the Caribbean. Do you believe the administration has given Congress enough information to determine whether strikes are legal, or do you think the president needs to get sign-off from Congress?
I would say yes to both. I'm not necessarily opposed to doing these strikes, but the president should come to the Congress, and he has to show that with no shadow of a doubt that we have a legal, constitutional way for doing this, that we're protected, legally. But also he's got to convince us that we have the intelligence that we're 100% sure these boats are shipping narcotics or fentanyl. That said, it's not a big stretch to go from going after terrorists like we have, and going after these narco organizations that are delivering fentanyl to our country. We have to remember 100,000 Americans are dying a year from this. I've lost 3 brothers to overdoses or drug abuse. I'm the oldest of 9. And I see the scars, not just in my own family, but tons of people I've worked with. They've lost a loved one or a coworker. And so these drugs are taking a terrible toll. And I think it is time that we take it this serious. But I'm not convinced we've done all the homework legally, or at least they haven't convinced Congress of this yet. And we've got to know that for 100% sure we have the right intelligence. But I think if you can do both, there will be general support in Congress.
Well, I am so sorry to hear that you have lost 3 brothers. That is absolutely devastating to hear, Congressman. So thank you for sharing that very personal note as well. I do want to turn to another topic, this report from Politico about hundreds of pages of chats between some leaders of young Republican groups. They contain racist, anti-Semitic, violent language. The New York and Kansas chapters are being disbanded in the wake of this. What was your reaction to seeing that report? And do you think disbanding these groups is the right move?
Well, anybody that put any of that ugly trash in these chats should be fired if they're in any position of authority. So if they're in the Young Republicans, they should be removed immediately. If they've been hired subsequently in the administration or another political person's office, they should be fired. There should be zero tolerance for this kind of stuff. And it was gross stuff. There was no defense of it. I know one of our leaders said, hey, they're young, but they're not young. We had people that were 30 years old putting these messages out there. And we should be the party that has zero tolerance for that kind of behavior. And, you know, this is being juxtaposed against the Attorney General's race in Virginia, where the Democrat nominee has all these, you know, saying he wanted the Speaker of the Virginia House to be assassinated, for his wife to see her children die. And we're going after the Virginia Democrats because they have not been clear. They have not asked them to step down and they didn't remove their endorsements. So we got to compare very clear response on our side, saying there is zero tolerance for we see it on our side. And we compare that to what the Democrats are doing in Virginia or other places. So when we don't do that, it weakens our hand.
And we will be discussing both of those issues because you're absolutely right. That is a significant issue in the Virginia Attorney General's race as well. Before I let you go, though, I do, Congressman, want to ask you about day 17 of the shutdown. Both sides seem to be equally dug in. The House is out of session yet another week. Do you see an off-ramp here, Congressman? How does this end, and when does this end?
Well, I thought I saw a clear off-ramp, particularly with Senator Thune, Majority Leader Thune, who I admire. He's from South Dakota. I get to fly with him quite a bit. He's a great man. He's been willing to negotiate with the Democrats, particularly in the Senate, but I would say in the House as well, on these ACA COVID-era tax credits. Most Republicans don't want to see these just fully expire. We'd like them reformed. We think there should be income caps. We think they should be targeted. We got to do it in the appropriations process because it's got to be part of the appropriations bill that requires 60 votes in the Senate, which means it has to be bipartisan. I think Thune is trying to go that direction. I would hope the Democrats would take them up on these negotiations to get that done. But as I brought this up with my colleagues across the aisle, some of them, even the more moderate ones, have made clear to me they're not really interested. This is really more about their base and the hate they have for President Trump, to show their base that they're fighting back. That's a tougher thing to negotiate from my vantage point. We're going to have President Trump for 3 more years. We got to find a way to work together, and we can't have a 3-year shutdown. And so I don't see a clear path for the Democrats this is more about President Trump and going after him. Now, if they have some narrow things like the COVID tax credits, I think we can get that done. And I think John Thune has shown a willingness to do it. And I think that may be the way out of this thing.
All right. Congressman Don Bacon, we covered a lot of ground today on a very busy News Friday. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you do have a wonderful weekend. Coming up after the break, sparks fly on the debate stage as New York City's mayoral candidates clash on key issues and trade personal attacks. With less than 3 weeks until the election, we have the takeaways and the state of the race. Stay with us on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. New York City's mayoral candidates faced off in a fiery debate last night. Former Democratic governor turned independent mayoral candidate Andrew Cuomo clashing with Democratic nominee John Mamdani, including over experience with Republican Curtis Sliwa, quite literally caught in the middle.
There's no job for on-the-job training. And if you look at the failed mayors, they're ones that had no management experience. This is not a job for a first-timer. Any day, you could have a hurricane, you have, God forbid, a 9/11, a health pandemic. If you don't know what you're doing,
Cuomo.
people could die.
Mr. Mamdani, want to respond?
And if we have a health pandemic, then why would New Yorkers turn back to the governor who sent seniors to their death in nursing homes? That's the kind of experience that's on offer here today. What I don't have in experience, I make up for in integrity. And what you don't have in integrity, you could never make up for in experience.
Some real fireworks there. That may have been the line of the night, by the way. It comes as a new poll shows Cuomo trailing Mamdani by 21 points with just weeks to Election Day. We should note Mayor Adams' name remains on the ballot despite him dropping out of the race. Joining me now is NBC's Sam Brock with more on the debate and this closely watched race. Sam, thanks so much for being here. So President Trump, obviously, as he does, loomed large over the race. What was the takeaway regarding President Trump last night?
Sure. So with Mamdani now, obviously, a clear front runner, as you just laid out, Kristen, in that poll. And it's even more extensive than what we saw just there. Among likely voters, it's 52% to 28%. So you're talking about a 24-point gap. That's that Fox News poll that just came out yesterday. But with respect to President Trump, his name was invoked pretty much from the very beginning of the debate onward last night. And Mamdani, before the debate even started, Kristen, marched with dozens of union supporters, local unions, from Trump Tower to 30 Rock, which was sort of a symbolic gesture that he's not going to be capitulating to the Trump administration. And make no mistake about it, clearly President Trump has not been shy about the fact that democratically run cities or leaders that he sees as adversarial to the agenda that he's trying to advance are going to be punished. That's already happened in New York with some $18 billion in federal funding that's been halted for things like the Hudson River Tunnel project, the Second Avenue subway, and President Trump several days ago singling out Mamdani, calling him a communist, which we know is not true. He's a democratic socialist, and saying that hundreds of billions of dollars could be at stake here if Mamdani is elected and becomes the next mayor of New York City. It feels like New York, Kristen, becomes just the tip of the spear in this clash between left-leaning cities and the federal government. I did ask both of the candidates you mentioned, Andrew Cuomo and Mamdani, what they think about the idea that National Guard troops are being deployed or attempting to be deployed in cities across the country, ICE agents, etc., and what sort of clash may be in the future here. Here's what they told me.
If it had anything to do with crime, he'd be going after the 8 out of 10 states that have the highest levels of crime, all of which are actually led by Republicans. What it has to do with is intimidation. That's what this is about. And we need a mayor who's not too busy coordinating with Donald Trump or receiving donations from the same billionaires that gave us Donald Trump's second term to
Governor, the president has withheld grants, obviously, to New York. He also has sent troops into cities around the country. Why would that not happen under your administration?
I wouldn't let him.
But how would you prevent it? What stopped him before?
Well, he sent the National Guard into 20 cities when I was governor. He didn't send them into New York.
Do you think this is the same political climate that we were looking at?
Yeah, I think we had battles royale. I don't think he wants to fight with me.
Kristen, one of the most interesting questions that was asked last night of the candidates is, when was the last time you spoke with President Trump? Cuomo said that it was more than a year ago after Butler, Pennsylvania, and the assassination attempt, which the Mamdani camp has questioned. The New York Times reports that there was some communication between Cuomo staff and the Trump administration regarding this race. Mamdani says he has never spoken to President Trump. Kristen.
All right. Sam Brock, great interview there after that already very fiery debate. We really appreciate your joining us with that update. And New York City isn't the only race we are watching next month. While Democrats are looking to flip Virginia's governor seat blue next month, Republicans are hoping they can flip New Jersey's governor seat red. Both races are going to be closely watched as possible bellwethers for the 2026 midterms. And former President Obama just endorsed the Democratic candidates in both states. Take a look.
Mikey's integrity, grit, and commitment to service are what we need right now in our leaders. Mike Sherrill is the right choice for your next governor. And I am proud to endorse Abigail Spanberger for governor. Republican policies are raising costs on working families so billionaires can get massive tax cuts. As governor, Abigail will stand up for Virginia families. She'll work to build an economy that works for everyone.
Meanwhile, a new poll shows it's an increasingly close race in New Jersey, with the Democrat ahead by just 4 points among registered voters, which is within the poll's margin of error. Joining me now is our panel, political reporter Rhonda Colvin, Michael LaRosa, former press secretary for First Lady Jill Biden, and Rob Bluey, president and executive editor of the Daily Signal. Thanks to all of you for being here. So, Rhonda, let's start with you. This New Jersey race shaping up to be much closer than anticipated between Mikey Sherrill, Jack Ciattarelli, the Republican. What are you watching for here, and why did this get so tight?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is going to be a nail biter. Everything has been pointing in that direction, that this is going to keep a lot of New Jersey political reporters and national political reporters at the edge of their seat on election night. One of the interesting things that I saw this week is there was a Quinnipiac poll that showed the percentages that you showed on screen, but it also showed an enthusiasm gap for the Democrat in the race, Mikey Sherrill. It showed that less Democrats are enthused about turning out for her when you compare that to the Republicans enthused about turning out for the Republican nominee in this race. So it's really going to be a turnout game, and I think that that is one of the reasons it's going to be hard to measure right now who's going to win it.
And, of course, the Republican in that race, Jack Ciattarelli, walking a fine line as it relates to President Trump, who did make some remarkable gains in New Jersey in this past election cycle. What we are seeing is just so fascinating, Michael, because you're seeing this endorsement by former President Obama. In the home stretch, we're used to seeing this from Mr. Obama. He likes to come in, make a splash at the end.
Yeah.
What do you make of the timing? Could it have an impact in the home stretch?
I highly doubt he has much of an impact in either state. He didn't have much of an impact in 2024 in that election. He was really pushing and did, I think, everything he could for Kamala Harris, but I don't think even he was able to really energize Democrats in a way that he once was able to. I think he weighs in very infrequently.
Is that that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Is it about the timing? Is he waiting too late?
I think the Obama people must think that they are still able to cast a spell over Democrats in the way that they could back in the mid 2000s. But young people really don't have a ton of fond memories for Obama, and every election leads to a reaction. And the 2016 election was really a reaction to a lot of Obama policies and wokeness. And there's been a big backlash to a lot of the people who felt rather voiceless during the Obama years.
So I want to talk about something I was just discussing with Congressman Don Bacon, Rob. This is in Virginia, this controversy that is swirling around these texts from the Attorney General candidate, Jay Jones, where he called for the Republican state speaker, House Speaker, to be shot using violent language. During this week's debate, he was pressed on that. Take a look.
I am ashamed. I am embarrassed. And I'm sorry. I am sorry to Speaker Gilbert. I'm sorry to his family. I'm sorry to my family. And I'm sorry to every single Virginian. I cannot take back what I said, but you have my word that I will always be accountable for my mistakes.
We have seen a window to who Jay Jones is and the way he thinks of people that disagree with him. How can we trust Jay Jones to prosecute an MS-13 gang member, knowing that he asked for an innocent Virginian to get 2 bullets to his head?
Rob, I think the question is, to what extent will this Attorney General's race actually impact the gubernatorial race between Abigail Spanberger and Winsome Earl Sears?
That's the big question. Obviously, she was down big. Early polls from the summer, and that shows that race is narrowing as well. And some polls are out showing Jason Miyares has moved ahead of Jay Jones in the Attorney General race. Obviously, Miyares has a record to run on, having served in office for 4 years. The Virginia governor can't, so Sears is in a tougher position, I think, to define herself and what she would do on Glenn Youngkin's coattails. But I agree with everything Michael said, in fact, on his analysis of that.
Can you guys get Congress together, please?
You didn't see any emotion in Jay Jones in that debate performance. All of the emotion was on Jason Miyares' side. Yeah, it was a poor performance, and I think that that's something that's missing from Abigail Spanberger. She had an opportunity to react to Winsome Earl Sears' challenge, and she failed as well.
You take me to my next question. Abigail Spanberger had the opportunity to call for him to drop out of the race. She forcefully denounced what he said, but did she go far enough? And what do you make of what Rob just said?
She didn't go far enough. And she had a gift-wrapped Christmas came early present for her campaign that could have been her Sister Souljah moment, which refers back to Bill Clinton during the race riots in L.A. in 1992 when he was able to put distance between himself and a radical left that he didn't want to represent himself or the values of the Democratic Party. Abby is going to win, but she really had an opportunity to put that race away by showing the common sense part of the Democratic Party, the moral compass, and leading and showing Democrats that you can have guts and you can disagree with your party and distance yourself and still be a successful candidate. You don't have to always wear the jersey when common sense tells you otherwise.
Rhonda, what has been striking to me is that this Attorney General's race in Virginia has become a national talking point for Republicans. We are hearing about it every Sunday, calling on Democrats to not just denounce Jay Jones, but to call for him to drop out of the race. How do you see this playing out, not just into these elections that we're all preparing for, but beyond that?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to watch how this one race in a state has sort of blown up and affected other races, and also just affected how Republicans are talking about Democrats and saying that, you know, a little bit of whataboutism, saying that, well, your candidate said this, and then you're also hearing Democrats say, well, the president says a lot of this stuff too. So, you know, I'm not sure where this all goes. I have been paying attention to what voters in Virginia have been saying, and you do hear a lot of them say, yes, Abigail Spanberger was a little too soft. She should have come out of the gate decrying this. But they've also been saying that the president says remarks like this, so maybe we give Jones a pass.
Well, Rob, you did hear the vice president when we became aware of these text messages among these young Republican groups, racist, all sorts of awful things that were said, so much so that the groups have now been disbanded in some states. The vice president saying they're just kids. What was really bad was what the attorney general said. Is that problematic?
Well, Kristen, it's interesting because I'm listening to The Bible in the Year by Father Mike Schmidt, who's a Catholic priest, and so is the vice president. And yesterday was the book of Sirach, and they were talking about guarding what comes out of your mouth. And so I think that we could all do ourselves a favor by thinking before we put things in writing. And yes, I agree with a lot of what Don Bacon said there. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard.
10 seconds.
Two Democrats this week made news. Katie Porter, candidate running for governor of California, the attorney general's race. These are two Democrats who are examples of public communication and the things not to do. They are case studies in how candidates should not react to crisis and to the press.
All right. Well, we had a lot of headlines to cover, guys. Thanks so much for being here to chew on all of it. Rhonda, Michael, and Rob, great conversation. And thank you all for watching. We will be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it is Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. I will have exclusive interviews with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Senators Rand Paul and Tim Kaine. You do not want to miss it. There's more ahead on NBC News Now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.